Lecture number 8 for Western Civ 1. Today we're going to be talking about the roots of the early Roman, the roots of Western civilization that come from the early Roman Empire. We talked last time about the Roman Republic, and the Empire is derived from the Republic. Last time we saw how the Empire had its roots in the demise of the Republic, as the Republican institutions broke down and as the forces of Julius Caesar and others were able to subvert the Republic. As we begin today, our devotional text is from Luke chapter 2, verses 1 through 6. It's a familiar passage, perhaps you'll recognize it. In those days, Caesar Augustus issued a decree that a census should be taken in the entire Roman world. This was the first census that took place while Quirinius was governor of Syria. And everyone went down to his own town to register. So Joseph also went up from the town of Nazareth in Galilee to Judea, to Bethlehem, the town of David, because he belonged to the house and line of David. He went there to register with Mary, who was pledged to be married to him, and was expecting a child. While they were there, the time came for the baby to be born, and she gave birth to her firstborn, a son. She wrapped him in cloths and placed him in a manger, because there was no room for them in the inn. There in Bethlehem, God's promises to people like David came to pass as his descendant came onto the scene here and fulfilled the prophecies of the coming Messiah. Jesus is born at an interesting time when Caesar Augustus ruled the world and decreed that people far away over in Palestine should be counted in the census so that taxation could be determined. God uses a variety of people in shaping history, and in his providence, he even used people like Augustus Caesar. Today we're going to talk about Augustus Caesar and to look at the empire that he helped to create and the context in which Jesus first came. Augustus Caesar played a central role. Let's start again. Augustus Caesar played a central role in the formation of the Roman Empire. In his time, he would come to be revered by some as the son of a god and the father of the nation. He's going to pursue policies that successfully cultivated his public image and accomplished his goal of building up the power and prestige of Rome. At his death, we'll find that he was deified and added to the pantheon of gods to be worshipped by the Senate there in Rome. Augustus did a lot of things right. He certainly led Rome towards the apogee of its prestige and power, but he never really resolved questions of succession, and subsequent leadership failures undermined the stability of the empire he created. Augustus, like people before him, aspired to have family members succeed him. He groomed his grandsons for the job of being his successors. But things didn't work out as he planned, and in many ways, the idea that he had smacked of hereditary monarchy, something that the Romans supposedly hated since the time of Tarquin the Proud. Such dynastic rule and autocracy was something that, Romans traditionally thought that they despised. But what they had found was that having a single ruler under Augustus, they had had a period of peace after almost a century of civil wars. And so the Roman people, grateful to Augustus, were prepared to accept the offspring of divinity to lead them. But good leadership skills are not always genetically conveyed or necessarily learned from good paradigms. So let's look here at Augustus, and as we begin our discussion of the rise of the Roman Empire, we want to think about how we know about this Augustan age. We have a number of literary sources. Some of these are more valuable than others. Some are like Suetonius in his document, The 12 Caesars. And he's kind of like read the newsstand liar sometimes. He contains some true facts, but he likes to sensationalize things. But he's an always interesting read, and he'll give you the salacious details on various rulers. A better source of history perhaps might be Tacitus, but Tacitus, like Suetonius, brings his baggage to the table. He's a person who longed for the old days of the Republic and has his critiques of the Roman emperors in his annals. Another general history source would be Dio Cassius, as he wrote his Roman history. In the time of Augustus, there'll be others who wrote, however, and we'll find that Plutarch would write his Lives of Illustrious Romans, and we'd learn about people like Mark Antony. Augustus himself would write a document known as the Res Gestae, where he's going to list his accomplishments. And so this gives us insights into how he saw things. He saw that he found Rome a city of brick, and he left it a city of marble. Well, that kind of aggrandizement of the capital of the empire came at cost. Taxes that people in faraway portions of his empire had to pay so that things could be grand in Rome. There's a lot of other sources we can go to that show us insight into life in the first century under the Roman Empire. One that's very interesting would be the writings of Ovid. In his Metamorphoses, we find his understanding of cosmogony and his retelling from a Roman perspective of the old stories about their gods and how things came to be the way that they are. But he'd write other documents too. One would be the interesting document, The Art of Love, or its corollary, The Remedy of Love. And what we find is that people in that day were much like people today. Ovid would promote a rather self-seeking pursuit of love, and he writes from a male perspective, and some of that's kind of interesting along the way. You'd find out, for example, that he'd say, instead of mooning about the fact that you don't have someone special in your life, you have to go out to where the fish are if you're going to catch fish, and similarly, you need to go out in public and be where the women are if you're a man in search of love. And I think that's obviously some pretty good advice. But on the other side, he was rather ruthless in his pursuit of attentions, and so we'll find that in winning someone's affection, he was rather ruthless. So an example would be that if you ask a young lady to go out with you, you might take her to the horse races, for example, but as you go, you want to show her every attention. As you walk up the steps to your seat, you lift the hem of her garment, and once you're blessed with a view of her lovely ankles, and on the other side, she's extremely grateful for your attention. What he recommends is that you should flick a piece of dust off her shoulder, even if it's not there, and of course warn the guy who's sitting in the seat behind not to bruise her tender back with his knobby knees. On the other side, when you want to get over somebody, his view is that you ought to go see this woman early in the morning before she has time to put on her face, and if she's clumsy, ask her to dance so she'll stomp on your toes. Or if she has bad teeth, you tell her jokes so she laughs and you're reminded of all her negative attributes. Ovid's an interesting character who gets himself into trouble in challenging some of the mores, the values of traditional Roman society. Other insights can be gained from Vitruvius, who wrote his 10 books on architecture, and we can learn a lot about Roman architecture that way. Pliny wrote his natural history, so in the areas of science and the weather and pharmacology, a whole lot of topics. Pliny provides insight into the state of knowledge at that point in time. Strabo wrote his geography. Others would write about Rome itself, and Livy would write his Ab Urbe Condita, multi-volume series of stories of Roman traditions, and it seemed to be rather moralizing history. Virgil wrote his Aeneid, again creating a story for Rome, connecting them to the ancient Greeks and the Trojan War that they so admired. Amongst the Jews, we can find that Josephus is going to write his Antiquities of the Jews, which is going to tell us something about how they came to be in contact with the Romans. So there's a lot of sources that are preserved for us from this period. Besides literary sources, though, we can always look at physical remains and to look at the great architectural achievements and sometimes inscriptions that the Romans would leave behind. So there's a lot of physical evidence that we can look at to find out about this period. As we look at the political context of Augustus's emergence as the ruler of Rome, in a position that he would call the princeps, he's the first citizen. What we talked about last time was the late Republican crisis. These civil wars went on for a period of about 100 years until various people took over, including Julius Caesar, who would be assassinated by people who wanted to maintain the Republic. And then Octavian, in an alliance with Lepidus and Mark Antony, formed a triumvirate to avenge the pro-Republicans, which they succeeded in doing at Philippi. For about 10 years, things went along peacefully enough between Mark Antony and Octavian, but then they'd come into conflict as Octavian ditched Octavia and became Twitter-pated with Cleopatra. So how in the world is Augustus in the West going to be able to conquer the great general Mark Antony in the East, as he has a greater population base and prosperity to work with? Well, Augustus is the adopted son of his great uncle Julius Caesar. He learned some things from his uncle, and he had served as a triumvir for a number of years, but eventually declares war on Mark Antony. And in the year 31, at the Battle of Actium, the forces of Octavian were successful and victorious, and the result was that the Senate declared him imperator, and they voted him consul. Now, the consul is only supposed to serve a singular year and not be able to succeed himself. But Augustus would be elected consul in sequential years from the year 31 until the year 23. In the year 23, the Senate decided to give him proconsular imperium. So subsequently, he didn't have to run for consul every year. Instead, he had consular power in perpetuity. Along the way, in the year 27, the Senate, wanting to honor him, gave him the new name Augustus. So subsequently we will call Octavian Augustus. The title means revered one. They gave Augustus tribunician power, which basically means that he was a representative of the plebeians and as a result could veto anything that went on in the Senate. And eventually they gave him the title Princeps Senatus, because the practice came to be that he spoke first in the Senate, and when Augustus spoke, everybody should listen. He set the tone, and people didn't speak against the position that he held. Eventually he would gain other titles which gave him greater power in the Senate, as they made him censor. He was able to determine who qualified to serve in the Senate. And so he could pick people of his choosing, and people that were loyal to him would support his policies. In the year 12 BC, he was elected to the position of Pontifex Maximus. This is the high priest. You might see the word bridge in pontiff. He's the chief bridge to the gods. He's the priest of all the gods of Rome. This is a position that he's going to use to try to promote traditional Roman values that he wants to maintain. Along the way, as he acquired more and more power, as the princeps, he was given authority over the legions in Egypt. This is of critical importance because Egypt is providing the wheat resources that Rome needs for its daily bread. If somebody was able to wrest Egypt from being able to provide grain for the Romans, there would be rebellions in Rome. So Augustus acquires this power and restricts the right of any other senator from going to Egypt without his permission. He also took control of the army. Now, the Senate continued to maintain control over armies, the legions, which were in peaceful provinces, but Augustus was responsible for armies on frontier provinces, and this is where the majority of the forces were located. So he controls directly the majority of the legions of Rome. Furthermore, he established a new legion, the Praetorian Guard, which were settled there at Rome. Essentially, this would become his own private army, about 6,000 soldiers who were there always living in Rome, And to become a praetorian, you had to be a good specimen, and you were paid better, and this was a great privilege to be part of the Praetorian Guard. Now, along the way, some senators, enamored with Augustus, aspired to make him dictator, to give him powers where he could just do what he wanted to do, but he rejected that offer. He virtually had control anyway, and so he wants to maintain the facade of the Republic. He's keeping the Senate going, but he controls who's in the Senate, and he controls the discussion of the Senate. From this position of great power, he's able to engage the pursuit of various policies and practices which consolidate his power and his political control. So his first policy, as I've already alluded to, was to retain the facade of the Republic. People in Rome continued to elect consuls and magistrates. In the Senate, he continued to let senators talk. And in maintaining the Republic, it was of importance for him to win battles, not just the political battles, but also the military battles that he might have. And as a result of being successful, there was oftentimes loot to be picked up, and he also made sure that he paid the troops to keep an army that was satisfied. This will be part of how he consolidates his power. The second strategy was to placate the population of Rome, to give them something of what they wanted. There were certain problems in living in the urban center of Rome. One was the great fear of fires. And so he develops a new sort of combined police firefighting force in a group of people known as the Vigiles. They keep vigil. The Vigiles were something that the people were glad to have. Secondly, he continued the practice of Julius Caesar in establishing colonies whereby retired soldiers were settled sometimes in frontier provinces where they would continue to project things Roman, and they'd identify with Rome. They'd have certain rights there as Roman citizens, even though they're away from Rome. In supplying the needs of the people, Augustus would promote the maintenance of the aqueducts that brought water to Rome, to provide them with running water that was fresh. These came sometimes from as far away as 60 miles, and they're an interesting piece of infrastructure that the Romans developed. Another thing that he'll do is to maintain the amusement of the people in Rome. He wants to make sure that the food supplies are there. This is going to keep them happy, but also to keep them entertained. And so there will be various games which will be put on as a way to keep the masses interested. Something they particularly liked were chariot races. The third great strategy was to preserve the peace. One of his ways of preserving the peace was by promoting stable economics. Within his empire, there was long-distance trade, and he suppressed any emergence of piracy. Furthermore, he promoted stable economics by having a currency that was largely silver. A stable currency promoted trade. People wanted his coins. Like American coins up until 1965, our silver coins had about 90% silver in them up till 1965. Today they don't have much, if any, silver in them, but there was value in the precious metal in the coins. And this will be something we'll find is compromised by later rulers who debase the currency, who remove the quantity of silver in the currency. And this will cause economic destabilization. But having good economics keeps people invested in the empire and prospering and feeling like they're thriving, and so there's something that they're willing to protect, to send their sons to go off into battle to protect, for example. Another way of preserving peace is by maintaining stable frontiers. Something that Augustus looked towards was creating defensible limes, the frontier defenses. One of the ways he does this is by expanding Rome up to natural boundaries. So in Europe, he expands up to the Rhine River, and if you come across from the Rhine River in the west towards east, you'll find there's not a long distance between the headwaters of the Rhine and the headwaters of the Danube River. And so the Rhine-Danube frontiers pretty much were frontiers that he embraced. in North Africa, in the Middle East. There would be deserts, but along the desert frontiers, he would have cavalry stations along the way and watch posts and roads that would travel along the frontiers so they could quickly move troops to defend the empire from possible intruders. Another way of maintaining stability was to use client kings. Herod the Great is such a client king that is used by the Romans. Using client kings meant that you had people who knew the local customs, and so you didn't have Romans coming in and offending them. Instead, you had locals who would serve the Romans' purposes and be subservient to Roman foreign policy and taxation, and the people could prosper under the Roman Empire. Well, not everybody likes this situation, but the Romans will use client kings for some time. At various times, we'll find some Roman emperors are going to choose to move away from having client kings and to rule directly. And we'll see that this is going to be something that happens in Judea, and it leads eventually to revolutionary groups emerging in Judea. The fourth strategy that Augustus uses is to promote traditional values. One of the traditional values that he wanted to promote was family. And so he proposed and pushed through social legislation, for example, certain marriage laws, whereby it was economically advantageous to be married. You paid less in taxes if you were married and if you had children. Marriages were in trouble in the Roman Empire. There's frequent occurrence of divorce, and certainly this is something that we can find even within the Roman imperial family. Everything wasn't perfect. There's a lot of dysfunction within Augustus' own family. At times he's going to, in fact, push certain divorces on people, like his stepson, his adopted son, Tiberius, who he'll force out of a happy marriage into an unhappy marriage that causes all kinds of dysfunction. In promoting traditional values, certainly Augustus, as the Pontifex Maximus, promoted the Roman religions, and he refurbished pagan temples of Rome. And he rejected certain new ideas that seemed to undercut some of those things. Particularly, he was concerned about the prophetic books which were emerging amongst some sects, and so he'd reject those. And he's going to advocate the Pax Deorum, the peace of the gods. It was during the reign of Augustus that they were able to close the gates of Janus. Their custom was that when they were at war, they opened these doors to a temple. And so we're going to find the emergence of the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. For the Romans believed that they had peace because the gods were happy. They were happy because the Romans were a pious people who served them properly and fulfilled their role. Something new that he promotes was the establishment of emperor worship. This would be something that is going to be a problem for Christians in later years, as Augustus had the Roman Senate nominate and select his stepfather, his adoptive father, Julius Caesar, as a god. And so Augustus himself could claim on his coins that he's the son of a god, and subsequently his successor, his stepson Tiberius, could claim that he was the son of a god. This is the sort of title that would have been on the coin that Jesus looked at when he said to give to Caesar the things that are Caesar's. So, promoting traditional values, Augustus suggests that they're going to hold on to old ways of doing things, but certainly Rome had changed dramatically. He is going to promote some new things. With the new wealth that's coming into Rome, he's able to engage in the enlargement and improvement of the capital city. He will also be a patron of the arts, funding poets like Virgil, and the production of plays and the performance of athletic festivals that would appeal to the people of Rome. As we think about the factors that contribute to Augustus's Roman peace, what we recognize as Christians is that God's at work in this. Certainly the Romans' military prowess was a contributing factor, and also the economic situation of the day contributed to that situation. But the Romans' power was something that was anticipated even when they were a weak group of people that were very divided. It's interesting to think about Augustus and to think about the difference a person can make on the events of history, and after that then to think about the difference we can make in our time. To think about how God can work in His purposes through us in our lives, sometimes even as we might not intend it. Now, Augustus was a fellow who's a great individual who rules the Romans for a long time, and it's kind of interesting to compare Jesus and Augustus and to look at the contrast that exists also. Jesus was a descendant of David, king of Judah. Augustus, he was born to patrician ancestry. Jesus was born in humble circumstances and laid in a manger. Augustus, he was born in a palatial setting. In the accounts of Jesus and Augustus, we find that both are identified as being child prodigies. For Augustus, his center of activity was Rome, whereas Jesus would be centered in Palestine. Jesus is submissive to the will of God. Augustus, he's going to seek the will of the gods. Jesus was certainly concerned about personal holiness, but Augustus was concerned about public piety. Jesus serves as our high priest. Jesus continues to serve in that role today, but Augustus Caesar, he served as Pontifex Maximus. Jesus claimed to be the Son of God, and Augustus claimed to be a son of a God. The difference is that Jesus was the Son of Man. He was the Son of God, and didn't just claim this. We find that Jesus exerted his power through his words, but Augustus is going to use force to coerce other people. Jesus encourages obedience by love, whereas Augustus is going to compel obedience by coercion. Jesus is motivated by other people's needs, but Augustus will find is motivated largely by self-interest. Jesus gave his all to others, whereas Augustus is going to accumulate great wealth for himself and his family. We'll find Jesus prays for his enemies, whereas Augustus is going to work pretty hard at eradicating his adversaries. Jesus' kingdom was a spiritual realm, whereas Augustus ruled over a physical realm. Jesus destroyed strongholds, where Augustus, he built up fortresses. Augustus, he built roads to Rome, but Jesus provides the way to heaven. We find that Augustus helped create the Roman peace, but it's truly Jesus who creates our peace with God. And while Jesus died and Augustus died, Jesus rose from the grave while Augustus moldered his fancy great mausoleum. Jesus rose from the grave to be elevated to the throne of God, whereas Augustus was just said to become a god by the Senate. Jesus rules the world now and forever, whereas Augustus, he ruled Rome from 31 BC up until AD 14. Augustus created a great empire, and that empire would succeed him. But one of the things that he didn't resolve, while he brought many things to the Roman people, was a question of succession. In Roman tradition, there was no precedent for replacing a princeps. How do you replace this fellow? The Romans certainly wanted to maintain the Roman peace, but in Augustus' family there were all kinds of problems. He particularly doted upon his grandsons and wanted them to succeed him, and since he ruled for such a long time, his grandsons came to maturity. But they didn't survive. Grandsons Drusus and Germanicus both died in somewhat suspicious circumstances. This leaves him without a grandson. And he forced his daughter Julia to marry his stepson Tiberius. The problem was Tiberius was already married, and so he forced him to divorce his wife in order to marry Julia. The problem is that Julia ran with a fast crowd, influenced by the poet Ovid, for example, and was quite immoral. And this was not a happy marriage for Tiberius, and eventually Augustus had his daughter exiled to an island, embarrassed by her lifestyle. But Tiberius would succeed Augustus and establish a system of dynastic succession. Members of the Julio-Claudian family, related to Augustus, would rule after Augustus in the time period between AD 14 and AD 68. The first of these would be that stepson Tiberius. He rules between 14 and 37. Now, as a character, he's a bit of an interesting person who's a bit morose. Certainly he'd had some sadness in his life. He had lots of opportunities. He studied in the schools of Athens and was a great soldier, but gets to be rather preoccupied as his life crashes in on him and he follows the directives of his stepfather. The result would be that as he comes to power, he would propose to the Senate that they would nominate his father as being a god, and they would make him a god. And yet, at the same time, he's always suspicious, thinking that somebody's trying to undermine his power, and so his secret police are always listening in to what goes on, and there's a number of people who pay the price. As he gets tired of ruling, as he gets to be an older man, he basically leaves the pursuit of most governmental affairs to Sejanus, somebody who's interested in his daughter. And the problem is that Sejanus, the captain of the Praetorian Guard, has aspirations of his own. And very interestingly, Sejanus will eventually be found out and exposed and executed. For us as Christians, an interesting connection is the fact that Pontius Pilate was a protege of Sejanus and had his position as the governor of Palestine through his connection with Sejanus. And it's rather intriguing to think about how Pontius Pilate, who once had been unfeeling about the Jews when he first came on as the governor in the year 26, would bend under Jewish pressure when they threatened to tell the emperor that he was no friend of Caesar. There's some question about when exactly Jesus was crucified, but it's intriguing to think that perhaps this is after Sejanus is exposed, and thereby Pontius Pilate was now politically more vulnerable. If you want to read about the stories of Tiberius' rule, you need to look in the account given by Suetonius. What you'll find is that he was rather preoccupied with himself and liked living on the island of Capri and wasn't too terribly occupied with the hands-on ordering of day-by-day events in the empire. Tiberius didn't have a son to inherit the throne, and so as a result, his relative Caligula will become his successor. Caligula was something of a sycophant along the way, who basically appealed to Tiberius' vanity and eventually would come to be the successor. As far as a character, once again, you can read Suetonius' accounts, and you'll find that there's all kinds of salacious stories about Caligula. He seems to come on strong, and then something seems to happen. Perhaps the power went to his head. Perhaps he had some sort of other problem, but he comes to be seen as something of a megalomaniac who creates a destabilizing government because people just don't know quite what's going on, and he doesn't show the honor to the Senate that his predecessors had. While they were ruling in all manners except by title as being kings, they kept the Senate going and they honored the Senate. Caligula failed to do that. One of the ways he failed to do that, if you read Suetonius, is that he had his horse elected to the Senate. This is not something that's going to win the Senate's support. People are also afraid of whether or not he might have them executed. He seemed rather capricious in this manner, and even amongst his closest associates, even with his wife, there's uncertainty. You know, what kind of pillow talk is this to tell your wife that you could have her lovely throat cut? The result was that he would be assassinated after a short run. Now, one of his associates, interesting for us as Christians, would be Herod Agrippa I. Herod Agrippa I apparently spread around the idea that it'd be good for Tiberius to step down and to embrace Caligula as his successor before he died, and apparently the secret police learned about that, and the result was that Herod Agrippa I spent some time in prison, and when Caligula came to be the ruler, he made Herod Agrippa I an honored subject and gave him gold that weighed the same as the shackles that had bound him, and he helped elevate his position back in Palestine at the expense of uncles like Herod Antipas, who was ruling Perea and Galilee. Caligula, though, was an egotistical person, and one of the things that you'll find in Josephus is that he ordered the governor of Palestine to erect a statue of the emperor in the temple in Jerusalem. The governor, knowing that that would cause problems, resisted, and as a result, Caligula sent the orders that he should go commit suicide. Fortunately for the local governor, the message that Caligula had been assassinated came before the order to commit suicide. So Rome is left in a question. Who will be the next successor? There are no grandsons of Augustus that they can go to, and so instead they look to another close relative by the name of Claudius. He's something of an unlikely character. If you read Suetonius, you find he wasn't a magnificent physical specimen. He was a rather booky scholar who had written a history of the Etruscans. And when the Praetorian Guard is looking for him, he basically is fearing for his life, and he hid behind the curtains. But apparently he never would have won at a game of hide-and-seek because his toes stuck out from beneath the curtains and they found him. He wasn't assassinated as he feared. Instead, they made him the new ruler, the new emperor. Caligula, meanwhile, would never be voted a god by the Senate. But Claudius depended upon people who were capable, particularly certain freedmen that he raised in prominence, and under Claudius we'll find that the Roman Empire continued to expand, under Claudius, Vespasian, the Roman general, would conquer Britain and bring Britain to the Roman Empire as a new province. And there's a whole lot of things that went on very positively. But during the time of Claudius, what we find in the book of Acts is that the Jews were kicked out of Rome, and this is what brings Priscilla and Aquila to Athens and Corinth, where they're going to meet up with Paul. There was a disturbance. And what we find in the Roman sources is that it was all about a certain Chrestus. Chrestus is a Roman name, which I think is confused with Christos. And the Jews are debating, is Jesus the Christ, that is the Messiah, or is he just a criminal who was executed by a Roman governor? But that caused disturbances in Rome that led the Emperor Claudius to tell all the Jews that they needed to get out of Rome because they're causing a disturbance, and he wanted to have peace. The Roman peace is able to continue under Claudius. There's some interesting architectural achievements that are made, and they continue to prosper. But in Claudius' own life, there's some problems. He's not very good, particularly with women. And after his wife dies, he marries a blonde bombshell from Germany. But this woman plays him the cuckold. She's unfaithful to him, and as a result, he's going to have her executed for her unfaithfulness. And so this is going to be a sorrowful thing. Then he marries again, and he marries, this time, Agrippina the Younger, a granddaughter of Augustus. And so here he is, marrying the granddaughter of Augustus. This looks like this could produce, an heir that might have some of the positive attributes of Augustus. And yet Agrippina brings with her to this marriage a child who she's had already in the person of Nero. And she has aspirations for her son to be the next ruler of the Roman Empire. As a result, she's going to eventually be implicated in the assassination of Claudius. Apparently, he died of eating a poisoned mushroom dish that she arranged to have fed to him. And this would bring her son to power. And so the last of the Julio-Claudian emperors, who rules from the year 54 into the year 68, is Nero. Nero begins his reign and has the first half of his reign. Actually, things seem to go on quite well as he depends upon his teachers. Particularly famous would be his teacher Seneca and other people who he left in charge of the empire. His mother, though, aspired to have greater power. In fact, one issue of coins has her face behind his on one side of a coin. And Nero comes to despise his mother and fear her aspirations for power, and so he's going to work to have his mother killed. But the thing is that Agrippina is a clever individual who perpetually takes antidotes, so his attempts to have her poisoned fail. He sends her off on a pleasure cruise on the amazing collapsing boat, but she swims to shore. He gives her a new bed designed to collapse and crush her, but she crawls out alive. So eventually he's going to have one of his soldiers do the deed to kill his mother. So he becomes a matricide. In his actions, he thinks that he's a great artist and a great athlete for that matter. One of the things that he does that gets a lot of Romans upset is that he basically liberates the Greeks from paying taxes. The Olympic Games are going on, and he goes to observe the Olympic Games, and he performs in the various activities, and he wins every event in which he enters, even the chariot race where he fell off the chariot. He's given the laurels for valor there. So the Greeks didn't have a whole lot of integrity when it came to giving out laurels, but they succeeded in winning freedom from taxation, which they really appreciated. As a great artist as well as athlete, Nero would put on performances, particularly musical performances, and one needed to stay awake during these events. And the old General Vespasian, who had served Claudius well, apparently fell asleep during one of these performances, and as a result was banished. So when people are listening to this rather poor artist play his music, apparently, according to Suetonius, some people feigned death, pretended to die or have medical problems so that they could be carried out and wouldn't have to listen to the rest of the screechy performance. Nero set about to build a golden palace for himself in Rome. But the problem was that Rome was already densely occupied by many people. If we read the various accounts, we find that there's plenty of 6-story buildings packed together in these insulae of Rome. And so he wants space in the heart of town to build his golden house, to build great structures. But there are people that are in the way. And in the year 64, a fire got started, and apparently the vigiles were asleep or off duty, and nonetheless the fire spread to burn a significant portion of Rome. About a quarter of Rome is singed by this fire, and the result is that there's properties that can be condemned and leveled, and he can build his brand new golden house in the middle of town. This gets him a lot of opposition, and it's under Nero that Christians first begin to be persecuted by the Romans in a systematic way. He identifies them as being separate from the Jews. Previously, they were covered by Julius Caesar's decision that the Jews practice a legal religion. But when the Romans distinguish Christianity as different from Judaism, then they begin to persecute it. And Nero delights in torturing Christians, impaling them on sharpened posts, igniting them to illuminate his gardens for chariot races at night, for example. Nero was a person who was capricious, and people didn't know how to deal with him exactly, and as a result, people were very, very afraid. And so as a result, there were various generals who aspired to power and brought their armies towards Rome. In the face of death, the Emperor Nero played his fiddle and apparently lamented the fact that, he was becoming a god. He thought that he would be becoming a god as he commits suicide rather than die at the hands of his enemies. The year 68 is a year of tumult in Rome, a year of military succession, as we have a variety of rulers, some old politicians like Galba and Otho, subsequently supplanted by military characters like Vitellius, who brought his armies from Germany, or within the same year Vespasian, who had been busy mopping up things back in Judea, fighting against the Jews. Nero had to pull him out of retirement because he desperately needed a general who could be successful. And so Vespasian, having loyal soldiers, is able to take over things in Rome, and Vespasian creates a new dynasty. And so in the years between 69 and 96, in Rome we'll find a restored dynastic succession with the Flavian emperors. So we move from the Julio-Claudian line to the Flavian dynasty. Vespasian was a tough old general, and he ruled for 10 years. In his time period, a lot of Nero's excesses were removed. In this time period, he would build some structures in Rome, like the Flavian Amphitheater that we know today as the Colosseum, and this would be built on the location of Nero's Golden House. But he had economic problems in his empire, but he did some things right. He certainly trained up his son Titus to be his successor, but he didn't pay as much attention to his younger son, Domitian. And so as Vespasian lived out his life and eventually died, he would be succeeded by his son Titus. Everybody knew that he was the designated successor, and the problem was that Titus would only rule from the year 69 until the year 81, and in the year 69 there were some dreadful problems that happened. Namely, Pompey blew its stack. I said Pompeii. The mountain Vespasius blew up, and the pyroclastic flow subsequently covered the city of Pompeii and Herculaneum and caused an ecological and economic disaster. For many people who are superstitious, they believe that something evil was happening. The gods must be against them. Now, Titus is an interesting character who was actually enamored with the Jewish princess Bernice, but he had been encouraged to drop his affections for her because she was perceived to be like Cleopatra, an Oriental princess who perhaps aspired to too much. But as Titus died of disease, his brother Domitian, who hadn't been groomed for power, became the next ruler, and he's going to rule from the year 81 up until the year 96. Unlike his brother, who was trained for power, he wasn't particularly trained, but he was quite egotistical and is going to have many problems in working with the Senate. He thinks that he's ruling because of his family connections, not at the behest of the Senate and the people of Rome. And so, as a result, we're going to find that there's increasing trouble under the rule of Domitian. But when he dies without an heir, the Senate is going to choose an emperor in the person of Nerva. Nerva is an old man who's not going to live too terribly long. In fact, his reign is only going to go from the year 96 until the year 98. But he establishes a pattern of good emperors, a pattern in which emperors choose their successors that are not their biological heirs, but successors who they adopt and who succeed them. And so we have this series of 5 good emperors. Nerva, who rules until the year 98, who adopts Trajan. Trajan rules from 98 until 117. Trajan is going to be a person who's a great general. He's going to adopt Hadrian. Hadrian rules from 117 to 138. And we have now emperors who aren't born in Rome, but because these individuals are great soldiers and leaders, they make good successors. Hadrian, who's famous for building Hadrian's Wall and for traveling around the empire for much of his tenure in office, shows that he had things largely under control. But he appears to die in a plague, and there appears to be a plague that begins to beset the Roman Empire, and Antoninus Pius will come to be the next ruler. His nickname Pius points to the fact that he's devoted to the gods of Rome. And he has a long reign up to the year 160 when he chooses Marcus Aurelius, a Stoic philosopher and military figure, to be his successor. The problem is going to come with Marcus Aurelius, who chooses his son Commodus to be his successor in the year 180. Marcus Aurelius dies in a plague, And things are getting to be tough in Rome. They've had this Roman peace for a period of over 150 years. They've been able to conquer their enemies, but now things are going to start to shake up as Commodus comes to power. He's going to rule for 11 years up until 191. But he liked to show himself as being a hero, a god in public, like Hercules. He liked to sport a lion's mane and skin as his devices. He sometimes would go fight in the arena against animals, for example. But people were very insecure, always wondering when he might have somebody executed. And as a result, he would be assassinated, and this would bring to power a new dynasty, the Severide emperors. The Severide emperors are going to rule from 193 until 235. Subsequent to that, however, Rome's going to be ruled between the years of 235 and 285 by a series of military succession. These emperors are known as the barracks emperors. These emperors are whoever has the strongest army in Rome at any one time, and in a period of about 26 years, they're going to go through about 50 emperors. I got that backwards. In a period of about 50 years, again from 235 until 285, they go through 26 emperors. So, on average, every 2 years. But what we're going to find is during this time period, there's some people like Philip the Arab who rule for as long as 10 years. So we're going to find there's several years where there's multiple emperors in a year. This certainly challenges Rome as they fall into another period of civil wars, of economic instability. As we analyze systems of succession, what we find is that the military plays an increasingly important role. For Augustus, he had the army on his side, and particularly had the Praetorian Guard. As long as emperors had the Praetorian Guard loyal to them in Rome, they could largely maintain control. But as generals of various legions out in the frontiers aspired to take over, this would cause instability in Rome. And this would weaken the Roman Empire. So what we'd recognize is it's certainly important to have good leaders. All organizations need to be led by good leaders, but also to have a clear system of succession and also of leadership development. To have something whereby people are chosen because of skill rather than just whose child they might be. We oftentimes call that kind of practice nepotism, where people are hired to positions just because of the circumstances of their relationship with somebody from an earlier generation. The Roman Empire, under the emperors, certainly continues to rule over the area of the Mediterranean as Mare Nostrum, our sea, and all along its shoreline. And this empire, which looked so fearsome, described by Daniel as being this fierce and terrible beast, was one that was nonetheless divided. It was divided ethnically, and we're going to find that it's going to fracture. Even though they have strong laws and there's equality supposed to happen before the laws, the system of participatory government had been undermined by Augustus. And while the emperors would sometimes maintain the facade of the empire, maintaining institutions like the Senate, electing people to various political offices, it's truly the emperors who are in control. The Roman Empire perpetuates things from the Roman Republic and provides a context in which Christianity can grow. What we'll look at this next time is what happens to the Roman Empire as it faces various challenges, how various individuals will seek to restore the empire and maintain it, and how its demise comes about. Thank you for your attention.